In the Arizona Territory, the land stretched wide and unforgiving. A vast expanse where the sun burned truths into men, whether they wanted them or not. It was a place where the horizon made no promises, and where the silence was heavy enough to crush a man who didn't know how to carry it. And in those days, before the railroads cut the desert into neat, manageable lines, there were some debts that could not be paid in gold. Silas Blackwood learned that lesson the hard way, long before his name carried the weight of law in town ledgers and land deeds. Silas had been younger, harder, and far more certain of his right to claim what lay before him. He had ridden with a survey party through Apache country, men hired to mark borders on land that had never asked to be measured. What happened next was never written down in the official histories. But Silas remembered it clearly enough until his dying day. There had been shouting, sudden fear, and a gunshot fired too fast by a man whose hands shook. When the chaos settled, smoke hung low over the rocks, and Silas lay bleeding from a deep gash in his thigh. Abandoned when the rest of the party fled in panic, he would have died there slowly, painfully, if not for a boy who appeared from between the juniper trees like a spirit drawn by the smell of blood. The child could not have been more than 10 years old. He carried no weapon, and he spoke no words. He simply knelt in the dust, tore a strip from his own shirt, and pressed it hard against the white man's wound. For hours that stretched into days, that boy shared his water and helped Silas to his feet, leading him mile after mile through rough country, until the outline of a trading post finally rose on the horizon. The boy never asked for thanks. When Silas finally turned to speak, to offer something, anything, the boy was already gone. That boy's name was Elias Thorne. Silas searched for him for weeks after his recovery, driven by a ghost of obligation he couldn't shake. And when he finally found the child again alone, thin, and grieving the loss of his own people, Silas did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He brought the boy home, not as a servant, not as a curiosity, but as a son. Elias grew up under a wide wooden roof, surrounded by money that was never truly his, and eyes that never let him forget it. Silas educated him, fed him, clothed him, and defended him with a quiet ferocity that only deepened the resentment of his two biological sons. Julian and Marcus Blackwood had inherited their father's sharp features, but none of his restraint. Julian, the elder, was calculating and cold. He walked the halls of the estate with a possessive air, already imagining the deeds in his pocket. Marcus, younger and volatile, burned with a loud, unthinking anger. To them, Elias was an intrusion. He was an Apache shadow that followed their father everywhere and refused to fade. They could never understand why Silas tolerated him. They never asked why Silas trusted him. But Silas did not raise Elias to be grateful. He raised him to be capable. While Julian and Marcus chased fast profits, gambling on short-term gains and cutting wages, Elias learned to read contracts before he learned to ride well. He studied soil conditions and livestock cycles. He listened more than he spoke. He learned the land as something alive, rather than something simply owned. Yet, in the Blackwood household, Elias remained undefined, not fully a son in the eyes of the world. Never just a guest, and certainly never invisible, no matter how much he sometimes wished he were. There was only one person in that house who understood what it meant to be truly unseen. Sarah Miller knew that feeling well. She was one of the many housemaids employed by the estate. A plain young woman with brown hair she kept tied back, and a habit of stepping aside before anyone noticed she was there. The other servants rarely spoke to her unless they needed something done quietly and quickly. The head housekeeper barely remembered her name, but that suited Sarah fine. Her invisibility allowed her to see things. She noticed how Elias moved through the house without drawing attention to himself. She saw how conversation stopped when he entered a room, how he was spoken about but rarely spoken to. She noticed how he held his temper when Julian sneered, or Marcus laughed too loudly at his expense. And most importantly, she noticed how old Silas watched him not with pity, but with expectation. The tension in the house, pulled taut for years, finally snapped the day the engagement was announced. The house buzzed with excitement as a young woman named Isabel Vance arrived in a fine carriage. She wore silk gloves covering her hands, and her smile was practiced and precise. She was well-connected, wealthy, and beautiful in the way portraits liked best: smooth, distant, and flawless. Silas intended the match to secure the future. Isabel intended to secure her status. At first, she was polite to Elias, perhaps even curious. But that curiosity curdled quickly when she learned the truth, not only that Elias was adopted, but that he was Apache. Sarah was polishing the silver in the corner of the parlor when it happened. She saw Isabel's smile tighten, her eyes cooling like glass. During tea, Isabel leaned closer, her voice soft but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "I was under the impression your father's generosity extended to business," she said. "Not charity cases." Elias did not respond. He sat still, his face a mask of calm. Later, when Isabel laughed lightly and remarked that she could never tie her life to someone so far beneath her station, Elias simply excused himself without a word. Sarah watched him leave. She saw what the others missed. She saw his back straight, his hands clenched, just enough to betray the hurt he refused to show. In that moment, watching his quiet dignity in the face of such casual cruelty, Sarah felt a pang of recognition. She knew what it was to be dismissed. She knew what it was to be valued only for what you could provide, and never for who you were. That night, Silas Blackwood made his decision. He did not announce it at dinner. He did not argue with his sons or plead with Isabel. He simply sat at his heavy oak desk, the oil lamp burning low against the darkness, called for his lawyer, and began dictating his will. Silas knew his sons. He looked at them with eyes unclouded by sentiment. Julian would dismantle the estate piece by piece, selling off the soul of the land for liquid capital. Marcus would burn through what remained in a blaze of gambling and neglect. But Elias was quiet. Elias was disciplined. Elias was patient. Elias would build, and so, as the ink dried on the parchment, the future of the Blackwood name was shifted away from blood. It was entrusted to the boy who had once knelt in the dirt to save a dying man. Silas did not speak of this change. He let the silence settle over the house, unsettling and thick. After Isabel departed in her polished carriage, the estate returned to its usual rhythms. Horses were fed at dawn, ledgers balanced at dusk. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Silas moved with a new gravity, as if time itself had begun pressing against his shoulders. He watched his sons more closely. He listened when they spoke, and when they did not speak, he listened harder still. Julian spoke often of expansion, of quick sales. He believed land was meant to be traded, not tended. When Silas questioned him, Julian smiled thinly and spoke of progress, claiming the old ways no longer applied. Marcus was less subtle. He drank too much and treated the workers like tools meant to be worn down and replaced. Where Julian was calculating, Marcus was careless. Both were dangerous. In contrast, Silas began assigning Elias small responsibilities, overseeing a cattle count, reviewing grain storage, sitting in on meetings with suppliers. Elias asked questions. He listened. He did not interrupt. When a supplier left, pale and stammering after Elias quietly pointed out discrepancies in the books, Silas felt a deep, settling certainty. Elias understood that wealth was not something to be spent, but something to be sustained. The servants noticed the change long before the family did. Sarah saw Elias spending more time in the study, bent over ledgers late into the night. She brought him coffee once, careful not to meet his eyes, and saw the ink-stained fingers, the tired concentration. He thanked her softly, as if she were doing him a favor rather than the other way around. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she was just a ghost in this house, passing through walls that would never belong to her. Still, she lingered outside the door, longer than necessary. The official reading of the will would not happen until Silas breathed his last. But the ink was dry. The seal was set, and the storm was gathering just beyond the horizon. Silas Blackwood had set a fire that would burn down the pretenses of his family, leaving only the truth standing in the ashes. And in the shadows, unnoticed and underestimated, Sarah Miller watched. And she remembered. The end of Silas Blackwood came not with a shout, but with a quiet exhale before the sun had even crested the horizon. He died as he had lived in his final months, with a heavy gravity, as if he knew the storm that would break the moment his heart stopped beating. Grief did not strike the household evenly. Julian masked his shock behind a wall of icy control, already calculating the logistical nuisance of a funeral. Marcus raged, throwing objects and shouting into empty rooms. A man terrified of a world without a father to clean up his messes. Isabel Vance returned to the estate, dressed in mourning black, her expression carefully solemn, her eyes searching the rooms for signs of her future standing. But Elias sat alone. He felt the loss not as a vacuum of power, but as the loss of the only man who had ever looked at him and seen a son. When the lawyer finally assembled them in the study, the air grew heavy with expectation. The reading was brief, clear, and absolute. The words hung in the air, defying the natural order the brothers had taken for granted since birth. Elias Thorne was named sole heir to the Blackwood estate, every acre, every head of cattle, every account. The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian's face drained of color. Marcus laughed once, a sharp, disbelieving sound that cracked the tension. Isabel inhaled softly, then turned to Elias with a renewed, predatory interest, as if seeing him for the first time. Then, the house erupted. Accusations flew like shrapnel. Julian demanded explanations. Marcus shouted that the will must be forged. Through it all, Elias stood still, his hands clasped behind his back, absorbing every word without response. He did not look triumphant. He did not look afraid. He simply looked tired. Later that afternoon, Isabel approached him, her voice gentle, her smile practiced. "I misjudged you," she said. "We all make mistakes." Elias met her gaze and saw nothing he trusted. He declined her invitation to talk further, And that decision sealed his fate. Julian and Marcus retreated. They did not dispute the will openly. Not yet. They knew better than to act while the lawyer was still in town. Instead, they whispered behind closed doors, their anger curdling into something colder and far more dangerous. Sarah Miller heard them because they forgot she existed. She had been sent to clean the storage corridor near the old study, an area rarely used. Tucked behind heavy oak doors, she worked quietly, as she always did, scrubbing shelves, while voices drifted from the adjoining room. Julian spoke first, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "It has to look like an accident." Zara froze, her cloth hovering over the dust. Marcus paced, the sound of his boots heavy on the floorboards. "The land road near the ravine," he said. "One slip, one loose wheel. He won't survive the fall. And if he does," Julian's voice hardened, "then we make sure he doesn't." Sarah's hands went cold. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow, every word carving itself into her memory. They spoke freely of timing, of witnesses, of how grief would cloud the town's judgment long enough for the estate to pass back to blood. They discussed the mechanics of murder with the same casual tone they might use to discuss cattle prices. They never once considered her. They never lowered their voices because they never imagined that the girl scrubbing the floors on the other side of the wall was a person capable of stopping them. By the time she slipped away, her knees were shaking. The next day, the trap was sprung. Elias hoed out, at Julian's request, a discussion about boundary markers. Julian had said, his face a mask of brotherly cooperation. Nothing urgent. Sarah watched him leave from the window, dread pooling in her chest. She considered telling anyone, but fear held her frozen. A servant's word against the Blackwood sons meant dismissal at best, and she had nowhere else to go. She stood paralyzed by her own invisibility, watching the man who had been kind to her ride toward his death. By nightfall, the rumors spread like wildfire. There had been an accident, a fall. The ravine road had collapsed beneath Elias's horse. The body had not been recovered, but the drop was steep, and the rocks below were unforgiving. Julian and Marcus returned to the house, somber and shaken, their story practiced and consistent. The household began to mourn. Sarah did not. She waited until the house slept. The silence of the estate was heavy, a suffocating blanket over the lies told at dinner. When the last lamp was extinguished, she ran. The desert night was cold, the moon casting long, skeletal shadows across the scrub brush. Sarah didn't take the road. She cut through the rough country, guided by instinct and desperation. She reached the ravine's edge and looked down into the darkness. She found him, not by sight, but by the sound of ragged, wet breathing. He was broken. He lay near the ravine's edge, blood staining the dust beneath him. His leg was twisted at an angle no leg should be, and his face was pale, reflecting the moonlight like marble. The brothers had been right about the fall, but they had been wrong about the man. Elias Thorne was not dead. Sarah did not hesitate. The sheer physics of the moment should have been impossible. Elias was a tall man, heavy with muscle, and Sarah was slight. But adrenaline is a powerful thing, and desperation is stronger still. She reached him, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. It was faint, thready, but there, he groaned when she touched him, a sound of agony that tore through the night air. "I've got you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she did. "I've got you." She couldn't lift him. She had to drag him. She gripped him under the arms, digging her heels into the loose dirt. Every inch was a battle. Her breath burned in her lungs. Her muscles screamed. She dragged him away from the exposed edge, inch by agonizing inch, toward the cover of the dense brush and the old trails that the horses couldn't navigate. She tore fabric from her own skirt to bind the worst of his wounds, her hands working by touch in the dark. The smell of copper and dust filled her nose. Elias drifted in and out, his body convulsing with tremors of shock. She leaned close to his ear, her voice fierce, anchoring him to the world of the living. "You're not dying," she told him, her voice cracking with the strain of it. "Not today." When Elias finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was not the vast, indifferent desert sky, nor the faces of the brothers who had betrayed him. He saw Sarah. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her jaw set with a determination beyond reason. He tried to speak, but pain stole his voice. He could only look at her, the girl who was never seen, the servant who faded into the walls, and realized that she was the only thing standing between him and the grave. For the first time in his life, lying broken in the dirt, Elias realized he was not as alone as he had always believed. Sarah looked back at him, her chest heaving, her hands stained with his blood. She didn't look like a maid anymore. In the moonlight, she looked like a warrior who had decided that death would have to wait. She pulled his arm over her shoulder, bracing her slight frame against his weight. "We have to move," she said, her voice steady now. "They'll come back to check. We have to disappear." And together, leaving a trail of disturbed earth behind them, they vanished into the dark, leaving the Blackwood brothers to believe their sin was buried forever. Elias drifted in and out of darkness for 2 days. In that time, the world lost its shape, dissolving into a fever dream where the only reality was pain. It came in waves sharp, blinding crests, followed by a dull, endless throb that seemed to rattle his very bones. His leg burned as if the ravine's rocks were still grinding against it, and every breath scraped through his chest like sandpaper. Somewhere beyond the haze, a voice kept pulling him back. "Stay with me." It was not a command, nor was it a plea. It was a tether. It was a voice that simply refused to let him go, anchoring him to the earth when the darkness tried to drag him away. When Elias finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was not the high, plastered ceilings of the Blackwood estate, but rough-hewn boards darkened by age and smoke. The ceiling was low, pressing down on a room that smelled of wood ash, dried sage, and old earth. A small fire crackled in the corner, barely strong enough to chase the chill from the air. He tried to move, and the agony that exploded in his leg forced a gasp from his cracked lips. Sarah was there instantly. She sat beside him on a wooden stool, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her hands stained with the work of keeping him alive. She froze when she saw his eyes open, leaning forward with a look of intense, terrifying relief, as if she were afraid he might blink and disappear again. "You are alive," she said quietly. Elias tried to speak, but his throat was a desert, his tongue heavy and useless. Sarah brought a tin cup to his lips, her hand steady as she supported his head. "Small sips," she warned. The water was warm and tasted faintly of bitter willow bark, but it eased the fire in his throat. He drank, his eyes finding hers. seeking an explanation for the impossible fact of his survival. What happened? He managed to rasp. Sarah hesitated, lowering the cup. The firelight cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion bruised beneath her eyes. "They thought you were dead," she said, her voice devoid of decoration. "They want everyone to believe it." The truth of it settled over him slowly, heavy and suffocating like dust after a collapse. The ride, the loose wheel, the fall. "They pushed," he whispered. "Yes," Sarah replied. "And you heard it all." Every word. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, filled only by the whisper of the wind moving through the scrub brush, outside the same wind that had blown across this land long before the Blackwoods claimed it. "They'll come back," Elias said, his voice tightening. "If they think there's a chance I lived, they won't," Sarah replied. And there was a steel in her tone he had never heard before. "Not yet. They were thorough in their planning. They believe the ravine took you. They'll let time do the rest." Elias stared at the ceiling, his jaw tightening as the betrayal twisted inside him. His legs shifted involuntarily under the blankets, and pain flared white-hot. He gasped, his hands gripping the rough wool of the blanket until his knuckles turned white. Sarah was on her feet instantly. "Don't move," she said, her hands pressing him back down firmly, but gently. "The bones are set, but it won't hold if you push it." He lay still, breathing hard, fighting the nausea. "So I'm crippled," he said, the bitterness leaking into his voice. "Not headless," she answered without hesitation. "And not dead." That mattered more than she knew. For 3 weeks, Elias did not leave the cabin. It had once belonged to a trapper who never returned from the mountains, tucked into a fold of land far from the main road, forgotten by everyone except the girl who had cleaned the maps in the Blackwood study. It became their entire world. Sarah came and went under the cover of early mornings and late evenings, a ghost slipping between two lives. She brought food bread she had saved, dried meat, apples and fresh bandages torn from old linens. She brought news, too. She told him how Julian and Marcus mourned publicly, wearing black armbands and speaking of tragic loss while accepting condolences with practiced sorrow. She told him how quickly the story of his death had been accepted, smoothed over by the family's influence and the town's indifference. A man does not vanish without questions. But grief dulled curiosity, and Blackwood money silenced the rest. But inside the cabin, the dynamic was shifting. The walls of class and station that had separated them at the estate, he the heir, she, the unseen servant, dissolved in the face of survival. Pain is a great equalizer, and Elias was in constant pain. There were nights when it took him so deeply that he had to bite down on a strip of leather to keep from crying out, sweat soaking through his shirt. Nights when the fever returned, dragging him into delirious dreams of falling, of hands pushing him toward the edge. Sarah stayed through all of it. She didn't look away. She wiped his brow with cool cloths. She read to him by the dim light of the fire when his eyes ached too much to focus. She argued with him when he grew bitter, refusing to let him wallow in self-pity. When he muttered that he was a burden, she reminded him firmly that his survival was not a favor he owed to anyone else. It was intimacy of the rawest kind. There was no pretense here. She saw him broken, weak, and terrified, and she did not flinch. And he saw her not as a maid, but as the woman who was single-handedly holding his life together. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, casting a glow through the cracks in the cabin walls, Elias spoke the question he had been holding back for weeks. "Why didn't you leave?" Sarah stilled. Her back was to him as she stirred a pot of broth over the fire. "Leave where?" she asked. "You could have run." Elias said, "Told no one. Saved yourself. Helping me. It puts a target on your back." She turned then, the wooden spoon dripping broth back into the pot. Her expression was unreadable, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. "No one ever sees me," she said simply. "Except you." The words struck deeper than any wound the ravine had given him. In the silence that followed, Elias understood. What bound them wasn't just gratitude, and it wasn't just survival. It was recognition. In a house full of people who looked right through her, he had been the only one to pause, to acknowledge her presence. And in a world that saw him only as a savage or an interloper, she saw the man. From that moment on, the air in the cabin changed. It was no longer just a hiding place. It was a war room. As Elias's fever broke and his mind cleared, his resolve hardened. Sarah brought him reports from the estate, her memory sharp and unforgiving. "They're already selling off land," she told him one night, setting down a loaf of bread. "Short-term deals. Poor prices." Elias closed his eyes briefly. They always were impatient. "What will you do?" she asked. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not as a nurse, but as a partner. "We wait," he said, "and we prepare." The plan was not built on rage. It was built on truth. Elias began to write. By firelight, his hand trembling, but his mind sharp. He drafted letters. Sarah became his eyes and ears. She memorized names, dates, and details from the papers Julian left carelessly on his desk. She recalled every word spoken in that storage corridor, every inflection, every careless boast about the accident. They gathered proof slowly, piece by piece. A ledger Julian had altered, a receipt Marcus thought he had destroyed, a witness, a stable hand, who remembered seeing 3 men ride out and only 2 return. Sarah smuggled ledgers out of the house under her apron, bringing them to the cabin so Elias could audit the theft of his own inheritance. Working side by side in the flickering light, their heads bent over the documents. Something quiet and profound began to grow between them. It wasn't a torrid romance. There was no room for melodrama when survival was at stake. It was a slow burn, built on the steady rhythm of shared purpose. She noticed how his hands, though scarred, were gentle with the pages. He noticed how quickly her mind worked, connecting patterns he might have missed. He poured coffee for her, a small gesture, but a revolutionary one, for a man who had been her master. When their fingers brushed as they exchanged a pen or a paper, neither pulled away. They were equals in the dark, conspiring against the light. But the body heals slower than the mind. Elias had to accept that he would never walk the same way again. The bone in his leg had knit, but it had knit crookedly. He tested his weight on a crude wooden crutch Sarah had fashioned from a tree branch, padded with old rags. He stood, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood, the pain flaring sharp and insistent. He took a step, then another, his gait uneven, a heavy limp that would mark him for the rest of his life. He swore softly, frustration boiling over. Sarah adjusted the brace on his leg one last time, her hands steady despite the tremor in her breath. "It'll have to do," he said, staring at the floor. "It is enough," she corrected him. "It gets you where you need to go." The day finally came when Sarah brought the news they had been waiting for. A letter had arrived from the city. The lawyer was summoning the family. Julian and Marcus were pushing for the final transfer of assets, believing enough time had passed to make the claim official. "The hearing is in 2 days," Sarah said, her voice tight. Elias looked at the ledgers stacked against the wall. He looked at the crude crutch leaning against the table. He looked at his leg, stiff and scarred. And then he looked at Sarah. "You don't have to come in with me," he said. "You've done enough. If this goes wrong, if they deny it." Sarah lifted her chin, the firelight catching the defiance in her eyes. She had spent a lifetime making herself small, stepping aside, fading into the background. But looking at Elias, she knew she could never go back to being invisible. "Yes, I do," she said. Elias nodded slowly. He reached out and took her hand. Her palm was rough from work, her fingers warm. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He simply held on, anchoring himself to her strength one last time before he stepped back into the storm. "Then we go together," he said. And in the silence of the cabin, with the evidence of their survival stacked around them, the plan was set. The world believed Elias Thorne was buried beneath a cairn of stones near the ravine. But the dead were coming home. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold. The kind of Arizona morning where the air was sharp enough to cut glass. Inside the lawyer's office in town, the atmosphere buzzed with a heavy, suffocating expectation. It was the day the Blackwood legacy would officially change hands. Julian and Marcus Blackwood stood near the heavy mahogany desk. They were dressed in impeccable mourning black, their suits tailored to convey a grief they did not feel. Julian was composed, his posture rigid with the confidence of a man who believes he has already won. He held a fountain pen in his hand, idly tapping it against the leather-bound ledger. Marcus lounged against the wall, smirking, already spending the inheritance in his mind. The lawyer, a man of spectacles and dusty statutes, spread the final transfer papers across the desk. "If you would just sign here," he murmured. "The transfer of the southern parcels will be complete." Julian leaned forward, the pen tip hovering over the paper. The scratch of steel on parchment was the only sound in the room. He began to write the first loop of his name, and then the door opened. It didn't burst open with a bang. It simply swung wide with a deliberate, heavy creak. A silence fell over the room, sudden and absolute. Elias Thorne stepped through the threshold. He looked nothing like the polished heir who had ridden out weeks ago. He was gaunt. His clothes were simple and worn, and his face carried the shadow of a beard. But it was the way he moved that stopped the breath in Julian's throat. Elias leaned heavily on a crude, hand-carved crutch, dragging his left leg forward with a grimace of effort. Thud, drag, step, he advanced into the room, his eyes dark and burning with a quiet fire. The room froze. Julian's face went ashen, the pen slipping from his numb fingers to clatter onto the desk. Marcus staggered back a step, his mouth opening soundlessly, his eyes darting from Elias's face to the twisted angle of his leg. Elias stopped in the center of the room. He stood tall despite the crutch, his gaze steady as he looked from one brother to the other. "I believe," Elias said, his voice calm and rasping with disuse, "that you are about to give away something that belongs to me." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight seemed to stand still. Julian was the first to break the paralysis. His chair scraped violently against the floorboards as he stood, gripping the backrest as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. A frantic, desperate anger washed over his features. This is some kind of trick. He spat, forcing a laugh that sounded jagged and thin. My brother is dead. We buried him. You buried an empty coffin. Elias replied evenly. And I believe that makes today's proceedings premature. The lawyer, pale and trembling, adjusted his spectacles. Mr. Thorne, he stammered, looking as if he were seeing a ghost. You are alive. I am, Elias said, if you would be willing to explain. Where have you been? Why the silence? I will explain, Elias said, his eyes never leaving Julian's face. But not alone. He turned slightly, shifting his weight on the crutch. And for the first time, the men in the room followed his gaze to the doorway. Sarah stepped forward. She wore a simple dress, dusty from the travel, and she held her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their shaking. She felt the weight of the room crash down on her, the scrutiny, the disbelief, the unspoken question of why a housemaid was standing beside a dead man. Julian scoffed, a sound of pure dismissal. Her, he sneered. She's nobody. A servant. Elias's voice sharpened, cutting through the air like a whip. She is the reason I am standing here. The lawyer raised a hand, sensing the shift in power. Miss Miller, is it? If you have information relevant to this matter, you are legally obligated to speak truthfully. Sarah swallowed hard. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she looked at Elias, and he gave her a barely perceptible nod. I see you. That look said, make them see you. I heard them, Sarah said. Her voice was quiet at first, but it gained strength with every syllable. Julian stiffened. Heard what? You planning it, Sarah said, turning to face him fully. The accident. The ravine road. What you would say to the sheriff afterward. Marcus lunged forward, his face twisting. That's a lie. Sarah did not flinch. She did not step back. You said the wheel would break, she continued, her eyes fixed on Marcus now. You said the road near the ravine was narrow enough that no one would question a fall. She turned back to Julian. And you said that if he survived the fall, you would finish it yourselves. You said grief would cloud the town's judgment long enough for the estate to pass to blood. The room felt smaller with every word she spoke. The air grew thin. Julian shook his head slowly, putting on a mask of pity. She's confused, he said to the lawyer, smoothing his lapels. The girl has always had trouble understanding her place. She's grieving, perhaps, and imagining things. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear that had been tied tight for years. My place, she repeated quietly, was in the corridor outside the old study, where you forgot I was cleaning, where you spoke of murder because you didn't think a servant's ears mattered. The lawyer leaned forward, his interest piqued. Miss Miller, can you recall the date of this conversation? Yes, sir, she said. 3 days before the accident. Late afternoon. Just before supper. Julian's jaw tightened. Hearsay, he snapped. The ramblings of a maid in love with a cripple. It proves nothing. Elias reached into his coat then. His movement was slow, deliberate. He produced a folded piece of paper, the edges worn. "This is a copy of a letter I wrote," Elias said, handing it to the lawyer. "Dated 3 days after the accident. It details the injuries I sustained. Injuries consistent with a fall, not a riding mishap. And it names Sarah Miller as the witness who pulled me from the wreck." The lawyer took the paper. He read quickly, his eyes widening. He looked up at Julian, then back at the letter. "Why did you not come forward sooner?" the lawyer asked. "Because if I had," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble, "I would be dead." Marcus laughed harshly. "You expect us to believe you hid for weeks, like some outlaw. Based on what?" "The word of a cleaning girl." Elias met his gaze. "I expect you to believe what you already know." Silence answered him. The lawyer turned back to Sarah. "Miss Miller, did you transport Mr. Thorne from the ravine? Did either of the Blackwood brothers return to check whether he was alive?" Sarah's voice hardened into steel. "No." Julian slammed his hand on the desk, the sound like a gunshot. "Enough. This is absurd. Even if he survived. The estate. The management. The estate." The lawyer interrupted coolly, leaning back in his chair. "Belongs to the heir, named in Silas Blackwood's will. Unless you have evidence that the will is invalid, or that Mr. Thorne is incompetent." He looked at Elias, battered, leaning on a crutch, but clear-eyed and formidable. Then he looked at Julian, sweating, panic breaking through his composure. "On the contrary," the lawyer said, steepling his fingers, "I now have reason to delay the transfer and notify the authorities regarding these allegations of conspiracy." Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. The color had left his face entirely. He looked at Elias, and for the first time, he saw not a charity case, but the man his father had chosen. "I don't want vengeance," Elias said quietly, breaking the silence. "I want the truth acknowledged." "You always were ungrateful," Julian whispered, the venom gone, replaced by defeat. "And you," Elias replied, "always mistook patience for weakness." The lawyer stood up. "This hearing is suspended, effective immediately. All assets remain under the control of Mr. Elias Thorne, until a full investigation is concluded." As the guards were summoned to escort the brothers out for questioning, the lawyer turned to Elias. "You should rest. Mr. Thorne, this will not be the end of it." Elias nodded. "I know." When the room finally emptied of the shouting brothers and the bewildered clerks, Elias turned to Sarah. Her knees gave way, the adrenaline finally fading. But he caught her arm, steadying her. "You did it," he said softly. She shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "We did." Outside, the afternoon sun washed the street in pale gold. People stared as Elias emerged alive, unmistakable, leaning on a crutch, but standing nonetheless. Sarah stayed close, her shoulder beneath his arm. "I never meant to be seen," she whispered as they walked toward the carriage. Elias stopped. He turned to her, ignoring the ache in his leg, ignoring the eyes of the town upon them. "You were always seen," he said, "just not by those who mattered." And as they stepped into the light, leaving the shadows of the lawyer's office behind, the Blackwood estate loomed on the horizon, no longer a prize to be stolen, but a future to be built. The wheels of justice, once rusted by influence and neglect, finally began to turn. The investigation into the Blackwood brothers moved forward with a speed that startled the county. Julian and Marcus were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Their lawyers argued, delayed, and postured. But the evidence was undeniable. Sarah's testimony was precise, and the ledgers she had saved corroborated every word. The brothers were sentenced before winter arrived. Elias did not attend the trial. He had no interest in watching the final collapse of his family name. Instead, he stood at the edge of the south pasture, watching a group of men repair a fence that should have been fixed years ago. That evening, Elias gathered the workers in the yard. The air was thick with uncertainty. These men had worked under Julian's cold calculations and Marcus's volatile temper. They expected a new master to bring new cruelty. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not make grand promises. He spoke plainly. "The land will not be sold," he told them. "Wages will be paid on time. Anyone who wishes to leave may do so with no penalty. But anyone who stays will be treated fairly." There was a ripple of surprise, a cautious hope. Then Elias added one last thing. "If you have grievances, bring them to me." He did not demand loyalty. He intended to earn it, but the past had one final ghost to exorcise. Isabel Vance arrived on the third day. She wore pale blue, her hair arranged carefully. Standing in the doorway of the study, as if waiting for permission to enter a room she once believed would be hers. "I'm glad you survived," she said softly. Elias did not rise from his desk. "I'm surprised you came," he replied. She stepped closer, her voice lowering into a tone of intimate confession. She spoke of misunderstandings, of being frightened, of not knowing who he truly was back then. "I loved you," she insisted, her eyes wide and searching. Elias closed the ledger slowly. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the emptiness beneath the polish. "No," he said, without heat or anger. "You loved what you thought I could give you." In the corner of the room, Sarah looked up from her own work. Isabel followed his gaze, noticing Sarah properly for the first time. A faint crease of distaste appeared on Isabel's flawless forehead before she could stop it. Elias saw it. "That will be all," he said. Isabel left without another word. And with her departure, the last pretense of the old life was swept away. The seasons turned. Winter came hard that year, settling on the land like a test of resolve. Elias's leg ached constantly. There were mornings he wondered if it would ever feel like it belonged to him again. But Sarah learned to anticipate the bad days. She adjusted his brace, paced his work, and argued with him when he pushed too hard. By spring, the estate was stable, not flourishing yet, but alive. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Elias stood with Sarah on the porch. The air was sharp with the promise of growth. "I used to think inheritance was about what a man leaves behind," Elias said, leaning on his cane. "Money, land, a name." Sarah watched the light catch the edges of the canyon. "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said, turning to her, "I think it's about what a man refuses to destroy." He looked at her, taking in the strength of her hands, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet grace that had saved him when the world had thrown him away. "I want you beside me," he said, "not as a favor, not out of gratitude, but as my wife, as my equal." Sarah did not cry. She did not gasp. She simply reached for his hand, her fingers interlocking with his. I promise to stand when you cannot, she whispered, a vow far more sacred than any spoken in a cathedral, and I promise to listen when I would rather command. Elias replied, they married that summer. There was no grand ceremony, no silk, no spectacle. The chapel doors stood open to the breeze, and wildflowers gathered from the valley lined the aisle. The people who came were those who mattered: workers, neighbors, families whose lives were tied to the land. The years that followed were not easy, but they were honest. Elias's leg never fully healed, but his spirit did. He learned to delegate, to trust, and Sarah became the bridge. She helped establish a small schoolhouse on the northern edge of the land. It was a place where children learned letters alongside numbers, and history alongside responsibility. But most importantly, it was a place where Apache and white children sat at the same benches. At first, it was awkward. Then, it became accustomed. And finally, it became unthinking. They funded medical aid for nearby settlements. They invested in water systems that kept drought at bay. Some called it foolish. Others called it revolutionary. Elias simply called it necessary. Decades later, when the story of the Blackwood estate was told, people did not speak first of the inheritance, or the scandal, or the gold. They spoke of the man who fell and rose again. They spoke of the woman no one saw until she changed everything. The true inheritance was not the dirt beneath their feet. It was the love that had grown there, a legacy built not on possession, but on care. And that, finally, was enough. And that brings us to the end of The Unseen Legacy. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the strongest people are the ones standing quietly in the shadows, just waiting for the moment to step into the light. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Elias and Sarah's journey. Do you think Elias was right to forgive the workers but banish the brothers? And where are you listening from? Today, I always love reading through the comments and seeing our community stretch across the map. If this story touched you, please leave a like. It really helps the channel grow, and share it with a friend who appreciates a good Western tale with a lot of heart. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story from the frontier. Until next time, this is Echoes of the West, keeping the spirit of the past alive. Stay safe out there.